Well, hello and good morning, evening or afternoon, depending on when you are tuning into this latest edie video panel as part of our Susty Talk series. This series was launched last year during what was lockdown number one here in the UK and has just kept going even as we are now easing out of lockdown number three. As you might notice, we've got 4 people on today instead of the usual one-on-one format, and that's because we're hosting a panel to mark the UN's International Day for Biological Diversity, which is this Saturday, the 22nd of May. And I'm delighted to have 4 experts, all from very different angles, to come and talk about this crucially important topic. So just to introduce people sort of clockwise as I see them on my screen, I've got Matt Williams, who is the Programme Leader for Climate and Land at the ECIU. I've got Julia Stellari, who is Sustainable Sourcing Director at Unilever. I've got Richard Benwell, Chief Executive at the Wildlife and Countryside Link, and I've got Josie Thornwell, the Head of Sustainability at housing developer Thacum Group. So thank you all for joining me this kind of miserable afternoon. I suppose it's very windy and stormy for me. I guess there are so many different ways we could start this, but I think it would be good, as we always get comments when we work on biodiversity about, well, isn't the private sector damaging biodiversity? What can be done to completely change this and get it to a net positive impact? So I'd like to come on to our panelists from the private sector first. So to Julia and to Josie, just to talk about the business's strategies and targets on nature to set the scene. I can see Julia nodding, so perhaps I'll come on to her first.
Sure, thank you, Sarah. So I'm happy to be here today. Thank you very much for inviting me. I think from the Unilever perspective, we can see that today the world is in crisis, and biodiversity is definitely one of the areas where we need to be engaged and be working toward having an impact. If we just look at the data, natural ecosystems have declined by 47% in just the last decade. So the need for action is absolutely urgent, and we need to take action now. In order to have that small window, take advantage of this small window of opportunity to save the world's forests. So with Unilever and our Compass commitments, we really see 3 areas where we are able to have the most impact today on biodiversity. The first is by ending deforestation in our commodity supply chains by 2023. The second, by helping to protect and regenerate nature, and doing that by protecting and regenerating forests, oceans, and land across 1.5 million hectares. And then the third, by achieving 100% sustainable sourcing for our key commodities and materials. And so, you know, when we think about how we're going to aim to do this, of course, the first element of it, protecting our supply chains against deforestation, well, that's really driven by our people and nature policy, which is a cross-commodity policy that aims to define how Unilever plans to implement through its supply chain the protection of natural ecosystems and the end of deforestation. For us, that really means leveraging digital in order to increase transparency and traceability in our supply chain, and to be able to work our way all the way back to the very origins of the supply chain, where ultimately we see that the deforestation impact is happening. And that is really where the farm and the natural ecosystem abut against each other. The second point is really about developing impact programs that aim to protect and regenerate those natural ecosystems. So one example of these is in Sabah in Malaysia with WWF and Forever Sabah, where we restore wildlife corridors that actually help to protect and essentially protect natural ecosystems, but create those natural habitats where wildlife can thrive, while at the same time addressing the productive need for communities to be able to use the natural land to produce the palm oil and other commodities that they need for their livelihoods. And then the third, by driving sustainable sourcing across our materials, this really rests on 2 pillars. It's the Sustainable Agriculture Code, where we have a requirement for suppliers and farmers to have biodiversity action plans. And then building on top of this, leveraging our regenerative agriculture principles, which we launched earlier this year, and where really we aim to go beyond by enhancing the ecosystem services that farmers can provide via their farmland through the management and implementation of the principles.
Fantastic. Thank you for such a concise overview. I know you're a really big multinational company, so there's going to be a lot of specifics on there, and I'm sure we can touch on some of them later. And from a big multinational FMC giant to a company that's right here in Sussex where I am, I'd love to hear a little bit more about Thacum Group's work on biodiversity, please, Josie, for those that might not be aware.
Yeah, and thank you, Julia, for the broad big picture, and for me to take that back down to what that means for local communities. And that's really what we're building. We're building new communities, and they have a shocking decline that they're facing in terms of their access to nature, and also if they were to visit somewhere with a huge biodiversity potential, actually the nature still isn't there because there's been such a decline since the 1980s, in particular in the UK. And as a developer, we are, we've got options on building on brownfield and on greenfield land use, and our impact varies on each. If we wanted to focus on something like biodiversity net gain, and we've got the Environment Bill coming in hopefully this autumn with a 10% biodiversity net gain commitment, we strive for that. We've got a 10% biodiversity net gain commitment that's been in place since our first sustainability strategy, which came out earlier this year. And we're looking to push that, and I believe we're the only developer to push that to 20% by 2025. Now, for a developer with a pipeline of projects, we know that there's some really challenging sites in there, and that's the interesting thing for us, is trying to figure out, well, how do we do that? And we've been looking at lots of different models around environmental impact bonds, and actually when it comes to biodiversity, what is important to us? So we started off developing our biodiversity principles, but really we know that we need to expand that. We need to include things like water neutrality. We need to include things like rewilding principles and dark sky principles to make sure that actually what's important as well is how do we connect people to nature, because we are providing homes for people and nature, and we need to find a way that actually, they are not exclusive, nature and human development, and that really we need to find a way for them to coexist and benefit off of each other. So the way that we're doing that through our biodiversity principles and extending those beyond that to look at those other wider principles really is getting us to understand, and I think the development industry and the construction industry gets biodiversity net gain. It's a great methodology, but we need to remember that it is a process, not an outcome. And that's what I think is crucial. We need to start thinking about what outcomes do we want to see on a development? How connected do we want people to feel with nature, and how that is protected for the long term? So those are just some of the things that we're looking at FACEM, and we're really lucky to partner with Surrey Wildlife Trust in particular, and work with DEFRA's Biodiversity Net Gain team to talk to them about how we're thinking about biodiversity.
Thanks, Josie. And you mentioned there that this net gain requirement is obviously part of the Environment Bill, which has been in and out, back and forth, delayed and then back. And then finally this week we heard a little bit more about it. So we learned more about these new legally binding targets for things including nature, waste and air quality. And we also had an update from DEFRA on its plans for tackling peatland degradation and reforestation in the UK. So I wanted to come on to all of this flurry of policy announcements, really, which I know that the Wildlife and Countryside Link and the ECIU have been following closely and reacting to quickly. So perhaps if I could come on to Matt to ask what you made of those announcements this week.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Sarah, and thanks for inviting the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit to be part of this panel. We exist to provide informed debate on energy and climate change issues, and I think that International Biodiversity Day, combined with these announcements that we've had this week, is a great moment to remind ourselves that nature and natural ecosystems such as peatlands and trees can help to provide a crucial role in achieving net zero and in absorbing and storing lots of carbon. And a landmark paper in 2018 actually showed that around a third of the effort to cut emissions by 2030 could potentially come from nature and from what are called nature-based solutions. The Committee on Climate Change said in its recent recommendation on the 6th carbon budget that some of the significant proportions of outstanding emissions in the economy by 2050 could also potentially be offset by nature in the UK. And these two strategies, these two action plans, the England Trees Action Plan and the England Peat Action Plan that were launched this week by the government, are long awaited and could play an important role in the government's efforts to get to net zero, particularly because a report by government itself, so by the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, along with the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, has shown that mostly due to the UK's peatlands, land in the UK is actually an overall net emitter. Instead of absorbing emissions, it's actually emitting more of them than it's absorbing. So our countryside isn't performing as you might expect in terms of helping us to tackle climate change. And the Committee on Climate Change has also said that we need to increase tree cover in the UK from about 13%, which is what it currently is, one of the lowest levels in Europe, to about 18% by 2050 to help offset and store carbon emissions. So alongside restoring peatlands and planting trees, there's a long way to go to get our land in a good condition for climate, and that will have biodiversity outcomes as well. And 70% of land in the UK is farmed. So farmers are going to be crucial in this effort alongside nature conservation organisations. And organisations like, for example, the National Farmers Union have highlighted that many farmers are already planning on significant efforts to restore soils, increase hedgerows, and increase the number of trees on their farms, and investments in renewable energy as well. So these plans give an opportunity for the government to work with and to support farmers and others to restore our peatlands and to increase tree cover across England and the UK as well.
Thank you. And Richard, did you have anything to add on that? I feel like that was quite an emissions-centric kind of look, which can be helpful as well in tracking these intersections between the nature and the climate crises.
It definitely can, and one of the wonderful things about talking about biodiversity and biodiversity targets now is that we will hopefully be redressing something of the imbalance in the way that climate and nature have been treated over the years, with really strong and binding climate targets and very sort of warm exhortations on the nature side that don't add up to the same heft. Perhaps I could bring a bit of gloom into the conversation at this point, because as we approach World Biodiversity Day and as we approach the Convention on Biological Diversity, where we hope to set global targets for nature restoration, it is worth remembering that this is the third time that we've been here, and that there have been international agreements to halt the decline of biodiversity twice before. And last year, the UN decided that the world had failed on all 20 of the global HE targets to halt the decline of biodiversity. So part of the problem has been that there have always been good intentions and wonderful projects that businesses and others can point to along the way, but they don't add up to the scale of effort needed to turn things around. And the pressures on the natural environment are so pervasive across our economy that it's going to take something really radical and special to properly turn things around. And the urgency to do that, it should be on all of our desks at the moment. I mean, it's worth remembering that we're in a pandemic that's been caused by our broken relationship with nature. Zoonotic disease is something that's likely to increase the more that we butt up against the natural environment and abuse it. It's worth remembering that non-communicable disease, things like obesity and mental health problems, are fast overtaking other forms of ill health, pandemic aside, as a cause of reduced welfare for folk, and that's very much to do with the reduced natural environment, a poor natural environment. Think of the 40,000 people who die early each year in the UK because of air pollution. And so while it's lovely to hear about things like individual greening projects from businesses, until we put in place systems to make polluters pay systematically and to reward those who go above and beyond to make it business as usual rather than a nice press release or a good case study, we're never going to create the sort of economy-wide conditions for biological restoration that we need to. And that's why it was actually excellent news this week to hear the government say that it would set a binding target for nature's recovery for 2030. Because it's that kind of legal strength that we need to be passed down from government, justiciable legal responsibility to achieve a certain end needs to be passed down to those in the private sector and those in the public sector who are causing the harm, so that if you're a polluting industry, or if you're an over-abstracting industry, if you're denuding the soil or stripping away the life from our seas, you can be held to account for that action, and we hope that's what's going to follow in the next decade.
Thank you, Richard. I was going to come on to that, and I'm sure we can come back to yourself and Matt for some more policy recommendations and wish list items in a moment. But I know that Julia has to sign off first out of our panel, so I did want to bring it back, and perhaps to touch on, as Richard said, some businesses like Unilever are really leading on this, have some great case studies, but it would be great to hear about what you think it'll take to make that business as usual, and perhaps in the absence or just waiting for policy, what the role of businesses might be in engaging with each other or suppliers or policy on this.
Well, I think there's a couple of points here that can be made. The first is, of course, as a global multinational business, we applaud and stand behind efforts of government to strengthen the requirements to take action to protect nature. And so we do this in the context of the COP15 and COP26, very rightly, as Richard was pointing out, and Matt as well. Nature and climate are intimately interrelated. And so by addressing one, you address the other, and by damaging one, you damage the other as well. This is in alignment, of course, with the Unilever Compass and the goals that we've set there, and we stand behind that as well in coalitions such as Business for Nature and We Mean Business, focusing on nature and climate respectively. But of course, you know, as a business, we have the opportunity to take action in our portfolios as well. So from the perspective of thinking about how does, you know, something like the Dasgupta review and the idea of embedding natural capital approaches, how could that impact, or how could a business like Unilever take that on? Well, we recognize that the value of nature and biodiversity needs to be embedded in decision making in ways that go beyond short-term profit and you know, GDP. So for example, you can see that in some of the portfolio choices that Unilever has made with its foods and refreshments division, going for a €1 billion foods business as an ambition, and the Unilever ambition to protect and restore 1.5 million hectares of forests, oceans, and land. This just shows kind of the scale and breadth of commitment that a company like Unilever can make. But I think it's also important to point out that, you know, natural capital approaches, it's one type of approach, but measuring biodiversity is difficult and it's quite early days. So how exactly to implement that, and how to ensure that the value of nature for people and the economy, it's visible and considered in decision making, will require advances in terms of how we measure biodiversity and alignment on how we implement that type of approach in decision making. So, you know, the way that we've been engaging on this beyond the business ambitions that I laid out and the programs that we are doing to protect and regenerate nature, our commitments to a deforestation-free supply chain, is by working with others. So we hope to see that the Task Force for Nature-related Disclosures has the same success as the Task Force on Climate-related Disclosures, that the Science-Based Targets Network efforts to create science-based targets for nature can also support in taking collective action, and elements like the Natural Capital Protocol become more mainstream, so that ultimately not just Unilever, but all businesses can take an aligned approach to how they incorporate climate and nature into their business decision making.
Thank you. And I actually wanted to come on to this because obviously beside this binding target, there are these new targets for business being developed in this way that we could have this embedded in all policy making. Obviously, the question mark for me as someone that's not sitting in this space but sort of looking at it from afar is that they promised to embed net zero and everything, yet there aren't always net zero mandates for everything at the Treasury. So will we really get natural capital mandates, and when? I don't know, but I wondered if anything had I wondered if anyone had something to add on this principle of accounting for nature. So is a natural capital approach the way forward, and what can we do to address some of the challenges that Julia's mentioned here? I can see Matt and Richard nodding, but you're both on mute.
Well, it's worth saying that there is a massive data gap before we can start doing ecosystem service, natural capital approaches properly, even in the UK. So we don't know the condition of most of our most important wildlife habitats. Most of them haven't been visited in years by the statutory agencies. We don't know what a basic habitat looks like for England. And so there are some very simple but ambitious changes that the government should be making in things like land use planning and access to environmental information to get that baseline of accountability that you need to do things like net gain properly that Josie was talking about. You need to know what's there on the ground before you can start holding somebody to account properly for whether they improve it or destroy it. And you need to be doing it for things like the condition of soils on your farmland. You need to be doing it systematically for things like urban nature. So there's a great big data gathering exercise that needs to be done, and an ambitious government would do it in a way that it's all held in a 21st century digital platform, so that if you're an offshore wind developer or a farmer looking at a planning application, you can go on and understand what you're looking at, what the expectations will be, and how you could invest in the environment in a way that's part of a plan for restoring nature. But while Julia rightly said that it's quite difficult to measure biodiversity, we do have some proxies for what damages biodiversity. We've heard about deforestation so far, but there are many more. We know that certain types of hydrological change and abstraction from the water system cause harm to nature. We know that development in the wrong places causes harm to nature. We know that extractive industries cause harm to nature, and until we can do that kind of granular nature data, we can look at the pressures on nature as the way to hold businesses to account for the harm that they cause to the natural environment, and translating that overarching environmental ambition into serious regulatory compliance-based requirements for industries to reduce their pressures on nature has got to be the way to drive investment in nature, in the same way as we've seen the billions invested in carbon over the last decade.
I actually think that's a great related point. In terms of carbon offsetting from a business perspective, I want to see the same rigor with biodiversity. From my perspective, if we're going to need to, accepting that there are a pipeline of some projects where we're not going to achieve our 20% biodiversity net gain target on site, and we might need to look locally for biodiversity improvements, I want to see the same rigor. I want it to be real, I want it to be measurable, and I want it to be long lasting. And until there's that evidence base that you talked about, Richard, then okay, we're still going to be able to deliver to a certain extent, and that's why we're looking at environmental impact bonds, for example, as a way to work with people like the Wildlife Trust to be able to provide that biodiversity improvement in a way that we're comfortable as a business that it meets the same authenticity as many carbon projects that are out there. Obviously, there is still benefit to doing really bespoke improvements. Those flagship schemes that you talked about, you know, we've proposed our first green bridge, which is amazing. It's something that as a developer I thought we'd never be able to put forward, to propose, and obviously that's a huge cost to a development, but in terms of the location and where it is, it's just the perfect opportunity to be able to do something huge as a biodiversity project. But not every site is going to have that applicable, and there are many other ways that those investments could be better funneled into nature recovery at a nationwide scale, and Julia, I'm sure you'd agree, at a global scale as well. So yeah, in terms of, I completely agree. It's all about that rigor and filling up that data gap and making sure that there is the same rigor and on parity with carbon.
For sure. I was going to say, if I had £1 for every time I've heard you can't manage what you can't measure, since I started my job here at EDIE, I would be very rich. I'd be off at the pub popping some champagne at this point, probably. But I just wanted to intervene, and I know that Julia has to nip off to another call, so I just wanted to take a moment to excuse her and to thank her so much for her time.
Thank you.
Fantastic. And Matt, I've seen you've unmuted yourself, so did you have anything to add there on that natural capital approach or that nature accounting piece?
Yeah, so I was just going to come in and mention a couple of things. So the government's own Natural Capital Committee that wound up a few months ago vindicated something that Richard said, actually, which is that number one, that the government in establishing that committee clearly views natural capital as something important, but the committee itself wasn't always supportive of the government's own approach. And for example, it criticised the government's reporting on its 25-year environment plan as saying that it lacked the baselines and the data and the metrics and evaluation, that wasn't clear enough to show what a an improvement or a decline meant, and that could be undermining the government's ability to value natural capital properly. Equally, whilst we want to avoid the exploitation of nature, that doesn't necessarily mean that brings an end to production. And there are those like the Sustainable Soils Alliance, for example, who are working on things like a soil carbon code, which could help to value the soil carbon on farms and potentially provide a source of income to farmers in the future. The Dasgupta review, which Julia mentioned, was not the first report to find similar things, that we need to value and restore natural capital, and the previous Millennium Ecosystem Assessment and the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity reports also found very similar things. And there's a new report out today, in fact, from the Green Purposes Company, which highlights that they think there's a $700 billion financing gap for nature-based solutions around the world. The UK government also recently announced that it's going to invest a third of its international climate finance into nature-based solutions. So the lack of data isn't always necessarily holding people back from investing in natural capital. And in fact, part of the peat and trees announcements earlier this week were a total of £640 million for those habitats that the government has previously announced, called the Nature for Climate Fund. And I think other countries will be looking at the UK's steps in both its domestic and international funding and seeing those as important signals of its commitment to natural capital, and potentially bolstering its leadership in the run-up to COP26 in November, which it is hosting.
Fantastic. And natural capital is a really fascinating topic to me. I could be here all day, but I did want to talk about some of those other kinds of capitals that we've sort of touched on with the intersection of this. So we've talked about the carbon sequestration and other climate benefits of nature. We've talked about the need for this to, as Josie said, create communities, and Matt and Richard, you've both spoken to the importance of the livelihood of farmers and others that depend on ecosystem services very directly. So I wanted to come on to how can we ensure that when we're delivering biodiversity benefits, that they've also got social benefits and climate benefits, that we're preventing these unintended negative consequences, and that we're properly collaborating to maximise positive outcomes. I see you all nodding, but I don't know if anyone wants to come in first on this one.
I'm happy to go first. So at Thacon, we talk about zero carbon placemaking. And really what that means is, as a home builder, we can design the homes to be zero carbon. The technology for that has existed for some time. We can also install things like electric car charging. But what that doesn't do is affect the things that you've been talking about around, actually, there's a wider ecosystem services around air pollution, around the way people live their lives, and that's where they're having the impact. So when we talk about biodiversity, obviously we could get a biodiversity net gain by improving the top right hand corner of a development that no one ever visits and it's fenced off, but that doesn't increase people's connection to nature. And we know from Natural England's recent research and the surveys they did about the importance that it is that people are close to nature and that they have that access. And over COVID, I think we've all learned that actually access to those natural spaces has greatly improved our sense of well-being during what was a really tough time and what is a tough time. So I think what's important to us is that we can enhance that as much as possible. And if we want to reduce air pollution, we're not going to be able to do that by just taking people's car parking spaces away. You're just going to annoy them. What you actually need to do is make sure that it's way more convenient for them to walk to the local shop. So that biodiversity net gain, if you can create a green corridor going through the site, and that's the most direct way for them to get to the shops, that it's more inconvenient to walk to the back to where their car is parked, to take a driving route that goes around the outside of the development and then takes them longer because they need to park on the outskirts and walk in. We're trying to create a sense of place that means people are more connected by nature purely through the infrastructure. And then when it comes to the social side, what we're hoping to do is have a structure of community days, whether it's wellbeing walks or whether it's having groups that are kids coming from the school on a Friday after school and can go around seasonal walks around the facilities on site, or whether it's the interpretation design on a site, meaning that actually the landmarks of how you direct yourself around a site is, oh, you turn left at the wildflower meadows, or it's right at the Suds. So, you know, that's the way that we're trying to do it, so that we know that people living on developments, moving on to new developments, is still going to have that 2-car comfort blanket, And what we're trying to do is build a sense of place through the physical infrastructure and through the community infrastructure that means that they can take advantage of the green and the wildness around them and appreciate it more, and hopefully that'll impact on the decisions that they make elsewhere.
There are going to be an awful lot of lost people if you say second right after the suds.
That's true, that's true.
I was going to say it's obvious how something like house building or community making, you can really see how this is all interconnected, but I don't know if Matt and Richard, you had any ideas on this perhaps for other sectors or more broadly.
Well, I think just to echo what was being said, there's clear public demand and support for restoring nature and for increasing public access to nature as well, for providing those multiple benefits, not just to biodiversity and climate, but also to people's physical and mental well-being as well. So a survey last year showed that 84% of people want the government to increase accessible nature-rich areas. 76% of them supported investing in nature as part of a recovery from COVID. In fact, I think I'm possibly stealing those statistics from Wildlife and Countryside Link. Internationally, beyond that, the Just Rural Transition Vision Statement, which was launched in 2019 at the UN Climate Action Summit, is an attempt to ensure that global dialogues and initiatives around transitioning the food and the farming system in particular to be more nature and climate friendly includes communities, people, particularly indigenous communities, in adapting to a new food and farming model, and achieving those multiple outcomes and benefits, I suppose. Alok Sharma, the COP president, said in a recent speech that it's important to incorporate the voices of indigenous people as custodians of 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity. And I think we will get a signal of the government beginning to see these as intersecting and parallel outcomes for nature, for climate, and for people as well, in, for example, its response in the coming weeks to part 2 of the National Food Strategy, which will look at the nexus between all of these issues, and in the way that the government may potentially see the join up between the UN Food Systems Summit in September, the UN Biodiversity Conference in October, and the UN Climate Conference in November, which obviously is hosting here in the UK. And the join up between those conferences and the issues within them that the UK government, but also other governments draw out, I think, will be a signal that they are shining a light on and realising the importance of these multiple outcomes working together.
Richard, I see you've taken your mute off, so I'd love to see if you had anything to add on that. And because we are running close to time, I'm going to let you have the last word, I think, on this panel. Right.
OK, well, just quickly on that. On the multiple benefits, it's absolutely right that you've got to concentrate on multiple benefits. It's a total old-fashioned crazy scandal that even in a country like ours, the poorest and most vulnerable people from an ethnic minority, are more likely to live in an area that is blighted with air pollution or a biodiversity desert, and that means your life will be worse and shorter. And that kind of social aspect to this is so important. And of course, as Matt said earlier on the climate side, we just can't do net zero without nature. I mean, the whole net bit in net zero relies on there somewhere being removals of carbon, and we don't have carbon capture and storage and all those technological fixes yet. You've got to do it with trees, and you've got to do it with peat, and you've got to do it with soils. So actually, for me, the worry is not that we forget the multiple benefits, it's that we forget the biodiversity that's the core of it. And too often with these things, decisions are driven by alternative objectives that are more in the public eye, like climate, and you end up with suboptimal approaches like the classic coniferous woodland planted on peatland. Biodiversity mustn't get pushed out of the picture. And that's why days like this International Biodiversity Day and COP15 have to be as important as COP26 in the public imagination. It's why we have to remember that our whole economy and society is absolutely fundamentally dependent on nature, and that until we genuinely get the good guys doing those flagship projects, doing them everywhere, properly recorded, and we properly punish pollution, environmental degradation, and hold the bad guys to account properly, we won't turn around this crisis of ecology that is looming, and we won't be able to enjoy the brighter future that environmental restoration offers.
Actually, Richard, I can't think of a better note to end that on. So biodiversity at the heart of everything. Lots of food for thought there ahead of G7 and, as you mentioned, the 15th Biodiversity COP. But for now, I'm going to have to wrap this panel up. So thank you all so much for your time and for your insight.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.